They found the photograph tucked between brittle census pages, its edges scalloped by time, its surface soft with age. A boy stood at the center, boots too large for his feet, hair neatly parted as if calmed by a patient hand. He cradled his sister's doll with a gentleness that felt rehearsed. The porcelain face tilted toward the lens in a permanent, pleasant calm. At first glance, it was the kind of image that warmed collectors. An ordinary childhood preserved, untouched by the century that followed. The longer they looked, the more the warmth thinned. The boy's eyes weren't fixed on the camera. They were angled slightly downward, as though watching something just below the frame, something he didn't want to drop. His grip on the doll was firm, almost urgent. Fingers pressed where the porcelain should have been cold. The doll's painted smile seemed too precise, its glassy gaze catching a light source that didn't exist anywhere else in the room. When the photograph was cleaned, shadows emerged that hadn't been there before. Creases in the wallpaper, a dark seam behind the boy's shoulder, the suggestion of movement frozen mid-thought. The doll's dress showed wear inconsistent with its age, frayed at the hem as if it had been dragged across floors long after the boy's lifetime should have ended. And then there was the handprint. Small, human, pressed from the inside of the porcelain chest, as though something had tried, once, to push its way out. By the time the truth surfaced, no one could remember who had first called the image cute. The photograph surfaced by accident, discovered not through deliberate search but through neglect. It lay hidden in a narrow archival drawer that had not been opened in decades, wedged between brittle census sheets and handwritten property ledgers from the late 19th century. The label on the envelope was faded and misleading, identifying it simply as a family portrait, 1898. Nothing more. To anyone cataloging thousands of such items, it appeared ordinary, the kind of harmless domestic artifact that filled historical collections in quiet abundance. There was no warning attached, no note of concern, no reason to pause longer than necessary. At first glance, the image seemed to confirm the label. The boy stood stiffly, dressed in Sunday clothes, holding a doll that was clearly meant to belong to a younger sister. The composition was typical of the era, the subject centered, the background plain, the expression neutral as demanded by long exposure times. It fit neatly into the category of turn of the century childhood photography, evoking a sense of nostalgia and innocence that archivists encountered daily. The photograph was handled casually, logged, and placed on a light table alongside dozens of others waiting to be scanned. What made this discovery different was not the image itself, but the place it had been found. The drawer contained materials from unrelated families, different towns, even different decades, as if someone had swept fragments of history together without concern for order. The photograph did not belong with the documents surrounding it, and yet there it was, untouched, unreferenced, and oddly preserved better than the papers around it. Its condition suggested care, as though it had been protected intentionally, despite having no recorded significance. As the archivist examined the envelope more closely, faint impressions became visible beneath the ink, marks left by an older label that had been peeled away. Whatever had once identified the photograph had been deliberately removed, replaced with something safer, something unremarkable. This small act of mislabeling transformed the discovery from routine to unsettling, hinting that someone at some point had decided the image was better left misunderstood than properly named. The moment it was scanned, the photograph entered the modern record, pulled out of obscurity and given new visibility. What had once been a private object, then a forgotten one, now became accessible to anyone who looked closely enough. The decision to catalog it as harmless was not made out of malice, but convenience, and that quiet choice ensured the photograph would be seen again without context, without caution, and without the story it had once been meant to hide. At the first sign that something was wrong did not come from the boy's expression or the age of the photograph, but from the doll itself. During restoration, the image was enlarged and adjusted to correct uneven exposure, a routine process meant to recover lost detail. As contrast increased and the shadows softened, the restorer noticed that the doll's glassy eyes reflected a narrow strip of light that could not be accounted for. The reflection was sharp, almost modern in its clarity, unlike the diffuse glow typical of late 19th century studio lamps. At first, it was dismissed as an artifact of scanning, a trick of pixels introduced by aging film and digital correction. Yet the more the image was refined, the more persistent the inconsistency became. The room behind the boy offered no visible window, no mirror, no polished surface that could produce such a reflection. The wallpaper absorbed light rather than bounced it, and the boy's own eyes reflected nothing similar. Even the buttons on his coat, dulled by time, showed only vague highlights. The doll alone seemed to be reacting to a light source that did not exist within the frame, as though it were aware of something outside the photograph's boundaries. Further magnification revealed that the reflection did not align with the angle of the doll's face. It bent unnaturally, stretching across the curve of the porcelain in a way that suggested depth rather than surface glare. The restorer compared it with other dolls from the same era, examining museum references and private collections, but none displayed the same optical behavior. Porcelain was reflective, yes, but not selectively so, and certainly not in a manner that ignored every other reflective surface in the image. The unease grew when a faint distortion appeared beneath the reflection, a subtle warping that hinted at movement rather than stillness. Photographs from 1898 captured time slowly, exposures long enough that any motion blurred into softness. This distortion was different, compressed and directional, as if something had shifted just enough to be caught, but not enough to be understood. It suggested that the doll was not merely an object being held, but something interacting with the moment of capture. Attempts to explain it through technical flaws failed one by one. Lens aberration did not fit. Chemical degradation of the emulsion did not account for the precision of the shape. Even the possibility of later tampering seemed unlikely, as the negative showed no sign of alteration. The inconsistency stood alone, defying both historical context and physical logic, quietly asserting that the photograph contained more than it was supposed to show, and that whatever had caused the reflection had been present at the exact moment the shutter closed. As questions around the photograph deepened, attention shifted away from the image itself and toward the boy's identity. Archivists began tracing the name written faintly on the back of the print, referencing it with census data, parish baptism records, and burial logs from the surrounding counties. The process was slow, complicated by inconsistent spellings and incomplete documentation, but the outline of a life gradually emerged. The boy had lived exactly where the photograph was believed to have been taken, and the year matched. His parents were listed. Even the clothing he wore aligned with the modest income recorded for the household. What did not appear anywhere was a sister. Census after census listed only one child. Church records showed no female birth between the parents' marriage and the boy's death. No infant burial suggested a child lost young. There were no gaps that could reasonably hide another sibling. The family had been small, contained, and meticulously recorded, leaving no room for the doll the boy held so carefully in the photograph. The absence was not ambiguous, it was absolute. This discovery reframed the image entirely. The doll could no longer be dismissed as a prop borrowed from a studio or a neighbor's child. Studio inventories from the period were reviewed, and none matched the design or clothing of the doll. Its lacework and stitching were too specific, too personal, as if tailored for repeated handling rather than display. The boy's grip, once interpreted as protective affection for a sibling, now seemed strangely possessive, his fingers positioned not as if presenting the doll, but restraining it. The unease sharpened when conservators examined the physical photograph under ultraviolet light. Oils embedded in the paper revealed patterns inconsistent with a single handling period. The print had been touched repeatedly, decades after it was taken. Finger smudges overlapped at different angles, some larger, some smaller, suggesting multiple handlers across generations. More troubling was their location. Many were clustered around the doll, particularly its torso and head, as if viewers had been drawn to it instinctively, compelled to hold the image there. Chemical analysis dated some of these marks to well into the mid-20th century, long after the boy and his parents were gone. Yet no record explained why the photograph had been revisited so often, or why it had never been displayed publicly. It had not been framed, exhibited, or referenced in family histories. Instead, it seemed to have been kept close, removed from view, but not forgotten, handled in private moments for reasons that were never written down. The realization settled slowly and heavily that the photograph was not documenting a relationship that existed, but preserving something that had no place in official memory, something that followed the boy through time, without ever appearing in records, leaving behind only traces of touch and a doll that refused to remain merely an object. The most disturbing detail emerged only after the photograph was subjected to extreme enhancement, a process reserved for damaged or contested historical images. High-resolution scans were layered and analyzed, stripping away surface grain and emulsion noise until the underlying shapes became clearer. It was during this stage that an irregularity appeared along the doll's midsection, something too deliberate to be a crack and too defined to be shadow. At first it resembled a flaw in the porcelain, a stress line caused by age or pressure, but its placement was wrong, curving inward rather than outward, as if responding to force from within. As clarity increased, the line resolved into contours that mirrored human anatomy. The suggestion of knuckles appeared first, faint but unmistakable, followed by the curve of a thumb pressed hard against the inside of the doll's torso. These were not decorative ridges or coincidental fractures. They were proportions, scaled correctly, complete with subtle variations that only living hands possess. The porcelain around them bulged outward microscopically, distorted in a way that implied resistance rather than breakage. What made the discovery more unsettling was the orientation of the fingers. They were wrapped inward, gripping, not pushing randomly but holding fast, as though the hand inside the doll was clinging to something to keep itself contained. The pressure points aligned with the boy's own grip from the outside, creating the impression of two forces locked together through the porcelain barrier. One holding on, one holding shut. The image now suggested an interaction rather than a pose, a moment of tension frozen between containment and escape. Comparative analysis ruled out pareidolia, the tendency to see patterns where none exist. Independent specialists were asked to examine the scans without context, and several identified the same shapes, describing them as finger-like without prompting. When overlaid with anatomical references, the match became impossible to ignore. The scale indicated a small hand, likely belonging to a child, yet too proportioned to be part of the doll's construction. No manufacturer from the period embedded internal supports shaped like hands, and no repair technique explained their presence. The final blow came when pressure simulations were run using accurate porcelain replicas. To create distortions matching those in the photograph, force had to be applied from the inside while the exterior was restrained. External pressure alone produced cracking, not bulging. Internal pressure alone caused outward fractures. Only simultaneous opposing forces recreated the exact deformation seen in the image. The implication was unavoidable. At the moment the photograph was taken, something inside the doll had been actively gripping outward, and something outside had been actively preventing it from doing more, locking that struggle into a single, silent frame that had waited more than a century to be understood. The final realization did not arrive as a single discovery, but as an accumulation of conclusions that could no longer be separated. Once the physical evidence suggested interaction rather than coincidence, historians and analysts began to question the very purpose of the photograph. In 1898, photography was deliberate, expensive, and ceremonial. A child was not positioned, dressed, and instructed to hold an object without intention. This image was not spontaneous. It had been arranged, framed, and timed, which meant whatever was happening with the doll was known, anticipated, and meant to be captured. Further study of the boy's posture revealed subtle tension throughout his body. His shoulders were raised slightly, his elbows locked inward, not relaxed as would be expected when holding a cherished toy. The stiffness aligned with restraint rather than affection. Exposure analysis suggested the photograph required several seconds of stillness, an unusually long time for a child to remain motionless unless instructed with urgency. This implied the boy was not simply posing, but performing a task, one that required focus and control during the exact moment the shutter was opened. The most unsettling insight came from comparing this photograph to others taken by the same studio. None shared the same framing choices. The camera was positioned lower than typical, angled upward just enough to emphasize the doll, rather than the child's face. The background was deliberately sparse, stripped of domestic details that would normally contextualize a family portrait. The composition funneled attention toward the object being held, as though the photograph's true subject was never the boy at all. Archival correspondence from the photographer's estate revealed a single cryptic note referencing a containment commission, an unusual phrase with no known industry meaning. There were no follow-up entries, no billing records, and no surviving negatives from the same session. It was as if the act of taking the photograph had been intentionally isolated from the rest of the photographer's work. This supported the emerging theory that the image was not meant to be shared, admired, or remembered in the traditional sense. The idea took shape slowly and horrifyingly that the photograph functioned as a seal. Not a memory, but a boundary. The timing, the physical restraint, the deliberate mislabeling, and the repeated private handling all pointed toward the same conclusion. The image was created to trap something in a single moment, fixing it in place through chemical, physical, and symbolic means. The doll was not merely holding something unnatural. The photograph itself was part of the mechanism, a visual container designed to bind whatever was inside to that instant forever. Once understood this way, the photograph ceased to feel old. It no longer belonged to 1898 or to history at all. It felt active, purposeful, and unfinished, as though its function depended on being seen, only under the right conditions, waiting patiently for the moment when someone would finally understand what it was made to do